record. Welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you here today for our kickoff YAC series event, Creating a Climate, to talk about climate change with our friends from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, to learn a little bit more from our youth advocate about what the Youth Action Campaign program is and what today's event is going to be all about. Just wanted to get everybody some housekeeping items to start. Please keep yourself on mute. There's going to be time later on to be interactive and have your phone or computer handy so you can kind of play along with our different events here. With no further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our youth MC, Sarah. Thanks so much, Sarah.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Sarah Rizvi, and I am a YAC advocate for international humanitarian law from the SoCal region. As a youth action activist, my role is to teach other high school students about international humanitarian law through a campaign which I work with the team to create. We're in charge of handling social media, hosting events such as game and movie nights, and whatever other creative outlets to help spread the word about and educate about international humanitarian law and what the Red Cross has done to support and uphold its rules. Each year, we have a different theme that we focus on, and this year's theme was conflict in the environment. Last year's Youth Action Campaign theme was protection for cultural property in international humanitarian law. But this year, we are very excited to learn about conflict in the environment. International humanitarian law is the body of international law that governs armed conflicts with the goal of protecting as many lives as possible. In the context of this year's theme, conflict in the environment, we talk specifically on how armed conflict is a major factor in the world's current state of the environment and how international humanitarian law seeks to change that. So now that you have some background information, I'd like to introduce our speaker. First, Pablo Suarez, who is an innovation lead at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, as well as visiting fellow at Boston University and artist in residence in the National University of Singapore. He has consulted for the United Nations Development Program, the World Food Program, World Bank, Oxfam America, and about 20 other international humanitarian and development organizations working in more than 60 countries. His current work involves a creative approach to risk management, ranging from self-learning algorithms for flood prediction to collaboration with humorists to inspire thinking and action. Pablo holds a master's degree in planning and a PhD in geography. And we have simply Laura Stewart, who is a consultant at the Red Cross Climate Center, working across teams on issues related to vulnerability, protection, and climate risk in fragile contexts. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, researching contemporary populist electoral politics in France and South Africa. Simply has extensive professional experience in sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and the United States, where her research and publications have focused on economic development, climate, conflict, digital transformation, and social policy. So now I'll pass it over to Cynthia, and if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the warm and generous introduction of Pablo and I. So what I will do, and I have to say, I am in the dark at the moment because I'm in South Africa and we have scheduled power outages. So about 6 hours of the day, we're in the dark to try and save and share electricity, but hopefully it'll come back in the next couple minutes. Without further ado, let me share the PowerPoint presentation that Pablo and I will be using. Sarah, could you confirm for me that you can see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful. Okay, so today's conversation is essentially going to focus very much like the theme that Sarah introduced on, and the pamphlet that you received on evolving discourse on climate change, conflict, and protection. The agenda, what we're going to try and do in the next hour is a brief introduction to the training, which is this element, and then we will introduce the ICRC and its approach to international humanitarian law in terms of its 7 pillars. Then we'll do an interactive activity with Pablo leading. Then we'll overview the ICRC and international humanitarian law to get an idea of the prevailing discourse related to climate change, protection, and IHL within the organization. We'll have a second activity, which will also be interactive, and then a very quick case study to really ground and think about how we might catch up how we might ensure that there's a catch up between our current approach and some of the trends that are unfolding and changing in the world, including those related to climate change and protection risks. And then we'll have a final interactive activity where you will have a chance to develop some headlines about what the future and success looks like in this space. Pablo, did you want to say anything before we go into the introduction?
Let's dive in. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm not sure how much familiarity everyone on the call has with the ICRC and how the organization approaches its work, but essentially the ICRC is a large organization and it's really grounded or united by the work of its various arms, including the national societies who are spread out across several countries. I should say you'll all receive a copy of this presentation, so no pressure to read every slide. Another grounding aspect of the ICRC's work, of course, is ensuring that there's respect for international humanitarian law, as well as the preservation of safety, physical integrity, and dignity of those who are directly and indirectly affected in situations of violence or armed conflict. There are my lights. That's my son who's excited that we have power now. And finally, the activities of the ICRC. Excuse me, the activities of the ICRC when it relates to protection are unambiguous in order to ensure that the actions of the organization do not have adverse impacts. So there's a do no harm principle that foregrounds our work, making sure that we don't leave anyone behind, that vulnerable populations are effectively protected and proactively protected by the work of the organization. And so this is a more detailed sort of overview of the 7 pillars of the ICRC. And again, this is the principles that foreground our work, and we can talk more about this in the activity, but essentially all of the operations of the ICRC are grounded in or rooted in humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service. So you'll know that we have a huge pool of volunteers across the world who support ICRC responses in situations of armed conflict and other situations of vulnerability or violence. Unity and then universality, which really is about pursuing a collaborative and equal environment in terms of the national society. So no one region that the organization serves is more important or more prioritized than others. With that brief introduction, we are going to go into our first activity, which Pablo will lead, and it's I Think, We Think.
Thank you, Sinfiwe. Feel free to stop sharing the screen, and friends from the organizing team, if you want to spotlight me so that people can see me, say hello. I'm Pablo. I'm originally from Argentina. I live in the Boston area. Most of my work is with the Global Red Cross Red Crescent family, a team based in the Netherlands, the Climate Center, where we help understand, anticipate, and address the humanitarian consequences of climate stuff. So today, if you're joining us here, it's because in part you want to learn how do we create a climate for having climate conversations. And we're going to start giving you a taste of how we at the Climate Center invite our partners from the American Red Cross, from national governments, from UN system, from academia, from all sorts of entities. How are we going to create a climate for talking about climate? Because sometimes this can be very contentious, sometimes can be problematic, sometimes people don't understand each other. So the first task will be playful. We're going to be playing a game. I'm going to copy paste in the chat. You should all be seeing bit.ly/ARC for American Red Cross, IHL for International Humanitarian Law. If you click there or type that in your browser, you should be able to see a blue screen that says, welcome to I Think We Think. Your game will begin shortly. Sarah or someone from the organizing team, can you confirm that people are seeing that if they clicked? I'm going to assume that's a yes. In the
absence, Pablo, sorry about that. Yep.
Very good. So please enter a name which can be your name or a playful display name. I'm going to enter Pablo Bot and click enter or click the little tick mark so that we know who you are. Because in this game, we're going to be collaborating. We're also going to be a little bit competitive. There will be winners. So I'm going to move on to the next stage. And this is very simple. What is in your mind when thinking of climate change and Red Cross? Think of one word. You cannot think of climate or change or Red Cross. What word comes to mind? The first word that comes to mind, write it in the number 1 slot. Then think of what else comes to mind. What additional word? Please type that in the number 2 slot. And then I'm sure you have one more thought. Please write your third thought in the 3rd slot. It may be that you're thinking not of one word, but one concept made of 2 words. Like Red Cross, it's actually 2 separate words, but we're going to type them as if they were one word, as you see in that example. So please write your thoughts. What's your first, second, and third thing that comes to mind? It can be whatever it is, yeah? Whatever comes to your mind. You cannot write climate change or Red Cross. And I'm going to give you a countdown. Your 10 seconds are starting. I hope you are writing that. 3 seconds to go. What do you think of when thinking of climate change and Red Cross? Well, your time's up. Now we're going to ask you, what do you think other people in this event were thinking of when thinking of climate change and the Red Cross? Do you think they were thinking exactly the same as you? In that case, you could write the exact same 3 words. If you think they were thinking something different, then maybe you would type something different. Here's the catch. Devaki, thanks for writing in the chat. We are inviting you to go to the website that I will copy paste again. There we go. So write the first word that you think came to the minds of others. Every time someone else wrote that word, you get 1 point. If 3 people wrote that, you get 3 points. If all 40 people wrote it, you get 40 points. Actually, 65 people, so you could get a lot of points. And then number 2, and then number 3. Interestingly, if you write the 3 words in the correct order from the most popular to the least popular, you get 5 bonus points. Good luck. I'm giving you 30 seconds or so to write what you guess other people were thinking. What do other people think of when thinking of climate change and Red Cross? Let's give you a few more moments. Not yet, Eric, but we're working on it. 10 seconds to go. What do you think other people think when thinking of climate change and Red Cross? All right, time is up. Now I'm going to push a button, and in that screen, each one should be able to see how many points you earned. Some of you may have won 0 points like me. Obviously, you guys are thinking things I wasn't thinking. Some of you may have more than that. Let me share the word cloud. On the right, what you thought people were thinking. Global warming, very prominent, but yet not many people were thinking about global warming. Environment, very prominent, but it wasn't as prominent in the actual thoughts. Disasters was one. Disasters was present in both sides. But then we see, for example, protection, which you thought about, but you didn't think that other people were thinking about. Yeah? Helping is somewhat present, but you thought of it more than you thought other people were thinking of it. What I love about this activity is that it reveals what's going on in our heads and what is the gap between what we think and what we think people think. I see, for example, hurricanes is also quite prominent on the right, but not so much on the left. There's usually, what I have noticed is there's a pattern whereby what people really think is more people-centric. You see conflict on the left. Yeah, people thought about conflict. It wasn't as prominent. People are thinking quite prominently about helping. How can we think of climate and the Red Cross work in the context of our humanitarian mandate? One thing I can tell you is that when I started working for the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center 17 years ago, some of you probably haven't even been born. People were asking me, why? You're the Red Cross, what are you doing in a climate conference? Because people thought that climate change was only about atmospheric chemistry, carbon molecules, or polar bears. And of course, it's true that it's a lot of that, but it's also about people and how do we help people be safe? How do we protect their dignity, their integrity, their well-being? So with that, over to Sinfiwe to carry us through more of our work. Thank you.
Thanks, Pablo, and what a fun way to start the exercise. I got exactly 0 points for the things that I'm thinking. So either I'm extremely disconnected from what other people think, or I have a little too much information about the organization's approach to climate change and conflict. But I hope after this section of the activity that we will have a shared sort of understanding of how the Red Cross and how the Climate Center approaches issues related to protection, to IHL, and to climate change. I'm going to go back now to the PowerPoint, which again, we will be sharing at the end of this session. Just a second, I've lost my PowerPoint. If you give me just one moment.
And meanwhile, I'm sharing, I advanced the web page so you can see who got how many points. And Larissa, congratulations, you're one of the 2 winners with 9 points. Over to you, Sinfiwe.
Thanks, Pablo. So in terms of the ICRC and international humanitarian law, our work is grounded very much by the Geneva Conventions. And so you'll see, based on the Geneva Conventions, that we have very specific, points at which the organization can intervene or can implement a protection response in situations of armed conflict and violence. And these are the Geneva Conventions that essentially regulate or give rise to the Red Cross's ability to intervene in those situations. The first is where there are wounded and sick soldiers on land, wounded and sick military personnel at sea, where there are prisoners of war, where there are civilians in occupied territory, so during wartime. And finally, what's called Common Article 3, which recognizes non-international armed conflict. And that would be mostly domestic conflicts, so civil wars, spillovers of war, or third-party interventions in situations of war. In those cases where the Geneva Convention gives the ICRC the right to act, there are 7 functions that the organization is able to implement, and we call these 7 functions broadly the ICRC's multidisciplinary operational response, which, and now I'm reading from the bottom left, gives the ICRC the ability to undertake the tasks incumbent upon it under the Geneva Conventions, and to work for the faithful application of international humanitarian law, which is applicable in armed conflicts, and to take cognizance of any complaints based on alleged breaches of that law. So what you can take from that is not only do the Geneva Conventions give rise to the ICRC's work, but also where there are allegations of a breach of international humanitarian law, that gives the ICRC an opportunity to exercise its multidisciplinary operational response. And what are those functions? In these situations, again, where the Geneva Conventions apply, or where there is an actual or perceived violation of international humanitarian law, the ICRC has a monitoring function, a catalyst function, which is quite important in terms of discussion. And you'll remember one of the 7 pillars was around humanity, for example. So ensuring that we are giving equal treatment to both government groups, experts, as well as those who are actively engaged in armed conflicts. The ICRC actually has a catalyst function, even in relation to insurgent groups, for example, or those who are enacting violence. The organization has a promotion function, a guardian angel, and watchdog function, which is related to those situations where there are perceived violations of IHL. The ICRC acts as a watchdog by raising the alarm, so raising awareness about serious violations of IHL. And finally, direct action. So in situations of armed conflict, the ICRC can make direct and practical contributions to the application of law. So you might see ICRC personnel who are either spiritual leaders, who are dressed in security or soldier uniforms. They're not actively engaged in the war, but they're there to provide that direct action and security function. And with that, we are going to go into activity 2, the cartoon gallery, which Pablo is going to lead us through.
Thank you, Sinfiwe. So hello, friends, again. You know, there's many ways to try to have conversations. Sinfiwe, if you don't mind stopping the screen share. I have found that whether it's because of technical difficulty, I used to be a full-time scientist, full-time researcher, sharing with disaster managers, with communities at risk, with government officials, with other experts from other fields, what we knew about a changing climate, whether it's tomorrow's hurricane or long-term sea level rise. And I was extremely good at putting people to sleep, because people tend to tune out when they don't think they care about it. And I've learned that it's important to work with people who know how to engage. And when you're having difficult conversations, it turns out that some of our best collaborators can be artists, including professional humorists. You may be perplexed. What do you mean professional humorists? We're here to talk about climate change. Climate change is serious. Well, yes, it's serious, and people get very defensive about it, or very defensive by attack about it. How are we going to try to enable a rich climate for having climate conversations? I'm going to share with you momentarily one of my favorite graphs. I'm a math geek, so I need to communicate with graphs. One of my favorite graphs about climate in the context of everything else that gives shape to our humanitarian work in the entire world. Here we go. Let me make myself a little bit semi-transparent. So we are in the middle of a pandemic that we knew was possible. I grew up in the home of my grandma, who lived to 106 years of age. She was 8 years old when the 1918 pandemic hit her village in Italy. And she forced me to wash my hands every single day and was obsessed with germs. The pandemic is now with us, and it's here. Similarly, the climate is changing, and we know it will continue to change. How much worse it gets depends on how much we take care of the causes. Whether you change the light bulb, you use public transport, you don't chop the trees, your government does the right things. But the climate is changing and will continue to get worse. How much worse depends on us. But there's also conflict. Whether it's, I don't know, racist police violence in the streets of your hometown, or weapons crossing borders somewhere in a distant country, things go up and down, often down when it comes to economy. When people need livelihoods and a farmer cannot harvest, or a tourist guide cannot take tourists because there is no work, because the nature that they were used to showing is no longer there, as I experienced with the beauty of Caribbean corals becoming more fainted. So disasters are collaborating with each other, not with intentionality. It's not true that the pandemic and the climate go to some dark room with cigars and say, "Yay, let's do this to the Red Cross." But we know that when they join forces, they have compound effects it was problematic to organize evacuations in the context of the first years of COVID when there was no vaccination. If these forces work together, how are we going to work together better? We need to talk. Now, how do we talk? Here's one example from one of the many UN climate conferences that I have attended. Every single one since 2004. Would you like to be physically present in this event? Do you think that this event will make people come up with the most awesome solutions and agreements? Well, I would argue that one of the reasons why we haven't seen enough progress is that events themselves about climate, about humanitarian work in a changing climate, they seem to be intentionally designed to be boring. Look at how many people are looking at their phones. And this was a photo posted by the conveners of the UN Climate Conference to showcase the event. You may see near the center of the screen, there's a fellow in a white shirt. Here's a zoom in. That's what it feels like. And when we, as humanitarians, want to have conversations about climate, there's a lot we could say, but if we keep honking messages that people don't want to listen, it will be like this cartoon. If you're stuck, there's a problem with the system. No matter how much you honk, there won't be resolution ahead of you unless you understand what's going on with the system. And we have found that humor can help create breakthroughs in the desire to learn, in the desire to understand, in the desire to connect. Someone very wise once told me, no one cares how much you know, Pablo, until they know how much you care. So what we're going to do now is to invite you to go back to that same website that you were before. Here's the link again. You should be seeing a blue screen that says welcome to galleries. You can stay anonymous or type your name. This time it doesn't matter too much. And you're going to see a cartoon. It could be one that you have already seen. It could be a different one. If you scroll down, you will see an invitation for you to write a comment, a question, an emotion, an insight. What you write will be anonymously shared with everyone else in this event. So what you'll be writing is an invitation for others to think, to reflect, to ponder, to question. How can we create a climate that helps us talk about climate change? So you should be able to see it. Please, after you've typed, you may need to scroll down to push the yellow submit button. And with that, you will have submitted what you have in mind, and then push the arrow to see the next one. There are somewhere between 6 and 8 cartoons. So go for it, enjoy. We're going to give you about 5 minutes or less to view, appreciate, enjoy, reflect, and share. If needed, you can type on the cartoon. You can click on the cartoon to see it in a bigger size. Good, I see the comments are coming. Thank you. Imagine your favorite music, conducive to reflection. Excellent. The messages keep coming. If possible, try to link what you see in the cartoon and what it makes you think or feel with your engagement with the Red Cross. What does it mean as a volunteer, as a member of the team of the American Red Cross, to think of climate, to see these depictions that somehow relate to our climate? Let's give you less than 2 minutes. The comments are coming loud and clear and strong. You may revisit some cartoon you saw and submit an additional comment. Multiple comments per person per cartoon are welcome. And let's give you less than a minute. Great, some of the cartoons already got more than 20 comments. And begin to wrap up your ongoing comment and push the yellow submit button. Let's give you 10 seconds or so. Nice. So click submit if you haven't done so already. I'm about to advance. And there we go. So this is the phase where I normally go into the back end to delete any comments that may be offensive or inappropriate in any way. But we're going to trust that you have been sensitive. And now you can see all of the cartoons and scroll down. In some of the comments, I see, it will get worse, someone said. Too many things to track, overwhelming. Newer generations are burdened. Individual capacity is limited. Indeed, that's one of our big problems, yeah? How to listen, that cartoon about, yes, I'm right about this other thing is quite inspiring. I want to spend a little bit of time on the cartoon that you see near the bottom with the house in the flood. One person says to the other, it's not that I don't appreciate your recycling, Leo. I'm just suggesting it's not the only thing we should be doing right now. And that, my friends, is something that I want you to bear in mind intensely as you think of climate change. Climate change has been framed predominantly as an environmental issue. And it is. I wouldn't want to be a polar bear. Yeah? There's a lot of plastic which contributes and so on. But we as Red Cross members, in addition to trying to reduce our impact on the environment, we have a humanitarian mandate that is so powerfully aligned with the consequences of climate change. If the seasons are stranger, if the heat waves are killing more people, if the floods and droughts and fires in the forest and so on, they are the manifestations of climate change. And they require of us much more disaster preparedness, disaster response, risk reduction, health, attention, caring, all the things that are not addressing the causes of climate change, but addressing the consequences of climate change. We know that climate interacts with conflict in very complicated ways. There's more domestic violence. There's more husbands beating wives when it gets too hot, unfortunately. What are we going to do about it? So it's not only bad news. There's a lot we can do. And that's one of the biggest rewards for me in my work life. There's so much that we can do to help others to imagine a better future. So for now, I'm going to pass it over to Simfiwe, and you'll see me again in a little bit. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Pablo. Again, such a vivid and different sort of experience to have in a presentation or in a conversation like this, to be able to see, actually, like you said, the role of art and humor in some cases in helping us think more and think a little bit more honestly. It sort of catches you off guard. So you really have to kind of think honestly, and you can share a little bit more honestly when there's a prompt like that. So thank you very much for that. Pablo did mention, or one of the cartoons, in fact, has that graph about how disasters are collaborating, and yet we are not. And of course, we know that the general theme for today is thinking about how to have difficult conversations about climate, how climate is changing some of the, or how climate change, is changing some of the discourse, even around the work that the ICRC does. So that's really the next section of this presentation. We want to bring to the fore to highlight the ways that climate change is affecting the ICRC's work in relation to IHL and in relation to protection, so responding to perceived or actual violations of IHL. I hope you'll pay a little bit of attention to this section. It's a little bit heavy, but again, you'll have the presentation at the end, but really take this as an opportunity to think deeply about how even the work of an organization like the ICRC can change and can need to evolve in response to an existential crisis like climate change, like new and different conflicts, which are either as a result of or influenced by changes like climate change and other issues that are evolving. So the pandemic, for example, gives a new lens on issues related to conflict. So it's brief, but do pay attention, because at the end we'll be asking you to give us some solutions to how we can better implement the ICRC's work in these changing contexts, and definitely how we can better discuss these issues in the face of climate change. Okay, so protection and climate change through the lens of the ICRC. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of our work is grounded by violations. So protecting those who are impacted by armed conflict, by violence, and by other crises from violations of international humanitarian law, as well as violations of soft law, so international norms and customs. Some examples of those violations include limited access to basic services, either due to technical, material, financial, or structural challenges, and discriminating between groups. So I want you to really hang on to those examples of violations, because as you can imagine, climate change plays a facilitating role or a mediating role for some of those violations to occur. So how does climate change impact the ICRC's protection work? Some examples include changes in the interpretation of who qualifies as a refugee, changes to an individual's status from an internally displaced person to an international refugee. So if someone is internally displaced by a disaster, for example, and then there is conflict or other issues that require or lead to that person leaving their country and needing to flee for safety, then their status might change between their home country and the receiving country. Complications related to data collection, analysis, monitoring, and other promotions of IHL that the organization does. So you can imagine in flood risk events or in hurricane events, if there's a detention center, for example, the ability to store and keep people's documents becomes relatively difficult. In extreme heat situations, it becomes difficult, for example, to ensure that people are safe, that their physical and health safety is respected. And then in terms of proactive development of interventions intersecting with climate change and conflict. So you can imagine, again, in the case of an extreme weather event, it becomes difficult to negotiate access to specific geographic locations, whether it's because of the destruction of a road or bridge, or because an area has been overtaken, for example, that wasn't overtaken before by an insurgent groups. So those distinct challenges that the ICRC faces in terms of climate change can really be conceptualized in terms of the nature of the hazard that we're dealing with, what type of extreme weather event, if we're dealing with a cyclone, for example, a flooding event, an earthquake, the potentially affected groups. So who within the population is impacted by those hazards, and then the scope and duration of interventions, and the time that's available to address them. So some issues are constantly evolving. Others, we have forecast data, for example, for certain climate change events. But in situations where forecast data, for example, is incorrect or inaccurate, then the scope and duration of response might change from anticipatory action to a sort of urgent response that needs to be implemented. And all of these are in multiple ways impacted by a changing climate. We do have a short case study here to, again, inspire your thinking about the intersection between climate change and the ICRC's protection work. In this case study, we are in an unknown country A, Mediterranean country, with a population of 4 million. That population increases to 5.5 million because of an influx of refugees. Politics in this country are divided along religious lines. There's been peace for 20 years, but a non-international armed conflict has broken out. And so you'll recall from earlier in the presentation that non-international armed conflict can be a civil war or a third-party intervention. A non-state armed group in this case has taken control of the territory in the south. There are airstrikes, there are armed raids on homes, leading to an increase in detention. There's, of course, internal displacement because of the fighting that's taking place, but many are also remaining in their homes. Now, when we crystallize these issues or the situation in terms of the potential ICRC protection responses, we might focus on the airstrikes and raids, keeping people physically safe, detention, so risks related to those who are detained in the conflict, and then the refugees and displaced populations. I'm going to keep this up for 30 seconds to give you a chance to read it and think about additional points, either at which the ICRC should be or could be concerned, or additional ways in which climate change might impact this particular country. Give about 5 more seconds to read the situation in our country A. Now, with this overall situation in mind, here is some additional context. And this includes the ways in which climate change might affect the situation and additional ways in which the situation might evolve to raise protection risks and so to trigger the ICRC's protection responses. The first is in summer periods, there might be an increase of wildfires in forests, which compromise the country's cedar trees. If there is a large agricultural sector, which requires significant amounts of water, then there are serious challenges related to climate because of longer seasonal droughts, for example, and decreasing rainfall. If there is soil erosion over time from changing climate patterns and a decrease in rainfall, then there is a reduction in crop yields. If refugee sites are located near agricultural areas, and those refugee sites draw from the same water sources as local farmers, you can imagine that there are issues that might arise there related to access to resources and potential conflict or contention over those resources. Rising sea levels, as we mentioned, this area is in the Mediterranean, might push more of the population inland as they're concerned about flooding. And of course, there are issues there related to constraints of resources, the spread of communicable disease, for example, the ability of healthcare and other professionals to access these areas. And then additions to the situation which might be encouraged by climate change and conflict include those active hostilities in the south, where a lot of the agricultural land is located. Airstrikes may damage and destroy some of the wells which farmers use to water their crops. Houses might be burned, especially those that are located near the cedar forests. Detention centers that are being used may be located close to the sea, which is at risk of flooding, and that that raises a protection risk in terms of the safety of people's documents, people's bodily safety. And there might be, and of course, there's increasing evidence of weapons contamination, including anti-personnel landmines and grenades. So in an area where there's armed conflict, you may get the contamination of the soil, for example, as weapons are disposed in unsustainable ways. And those might also be abandoned and burned tanks and vehicles, which you tend to see on agricultural land or land that could be used for agricultural purposes. So with the case study in mind from country A, as well as these potential additions to the context and potential additions to the situation, we want to open discussion on how you might approach these issues differently if you were working with the ICRC, if you were a protection field agent of the ICRC. What suggestions would you raise for better discussing climate change and IHL in contexts like these? And what would a successful response look like? And we're going to think about this in terms of whatever reflections you have, you can share them as they come to you. But we're hoping we can come up with very quick headlines. So what does a successful protection response look like? How would the news agencies be reporting on the ICRC's work in country A if we effectively responded to the situation at the intersection of climate change and protection? I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I invite, I guess, Pablo, if you could help facilitate here. I invite some folks to write in the chat, if you would prefer to write in the chat. If you have questions, clarifying questions, put them in the chat. If you have reflections, put them in the chat. And then I think it would be nice to hear from some of you on the actual Zoom call. But Pablo, if you can please facilitate for us, that would be great.
Yes, thank you, Cynthia. And Jill, to answer your question, I'm instead of giving you an example, we're going to walk you through a few of the opportunities you have now to share your thoughts and your imagination. Cynthia, I am still seeing the slide. If it's possible to stop sharing, thank you very much. So before I start with that, let me do one thing here. This is one image created by one of our collaborators, a cartoonist, Peter Cooper. He's well published in the New Yorker magazine, which portrays in a metaphorical, symbolic, even beautiful way what Cynthia was referring to in terms of how climate and conflict interact. It pushes populations away. It can exacerbate animosities. It can be in the middle of extreme events that accentuate, that create this cycle of like a Möbius strip of coming and going. And we are going to ask you to warm up to the range of possible futures by playing a game called Headlines. In the game of Headlines, you're no longer who you think you are. You're a journalist, but not any journalist. You're a journalist with a time machine. You can go see the future and report on it. Let me start with the past. These are some old headlines from well before I was born. Great war ends, said some journalist, when there had been only one great war. There was, now we call it World War I. Man walks on the moon. You can imagine the date that that was published. Notice that these headlines, in addition to being short, they also have a level of kind of playfulness. There's a wordplay with purpose. Man walks on the moon. You could do a hip hop song out of that. Panic, the Dow Jones, a good headline is a headline that has a few attributes. First of all, it's somewhat short. The shorter it is, the bigger the font, and then the more likely people will read it. It conveys something unique about the instance being reported. It is as specific as possible. You don't want a headline that says problem solved. What problem? Solved how, by whom, etc. Ideally, it would be a useful headline. If someone tells me that the Great War has ended and I was hiding in a bunker, I can go out and celebrate with my family and friends. And if possible, convey a sense of urgency. So I am going to refresh your memory if you don't have it opened already, the usual website. What we're going to do now is very simple. We are going to invite you to write at least one good news headline and at least one bad news headline. Ideally, write many more. Type your name if you want. Once you advance, you will see a text box. You're a journalist. You have a time machine. What do you see tomorrow, next year, next decade, next century that could constitute bad news, which is an undesirable future, pertaining to the things that bring us together? Climate, a changing climate, humanitarian law, conflict, protecting civilians. This can be in the foreseeable future, in the remote future, can be a very plausible thing, can be a wacky thing. But please try, make it interesting. No one knows who wrote what, so be courageous, be creative, be a Pulitzer Prize winning headline writer. And make sure to include at least one good news, something that hopefully we want to see and maybe we can make happen. Can the Red Cross, can the volunteers, can you and your friends be part of that headline? At least one good news, at least one bad news. We'll give you about 2 more minutes. All right, I see the headlines coming. We already have more than a dozen. Keep it coming. What is that future like? Tomorrow, next decade, next century, what does the future look like? What is a good future you could report on? What's an undesirable future that we can do something about? Let's give you less than 2 minutes. If possible, think of the scenario that you heard from Simfiwe. What would that place, country A, look like next week, next decade? All right, we have about 30 headlines. Let's give you a minute or less. Be brave, journalists. And start wrapping up the one you're writing, because you have 5 seconds or less. And 3, 2, 1. And dear friends, you have just become the editor. Each of you is going to be presented with one randomly selected headline, most likely written by someone else. And the heart at the bottom is not whether you like the news, because we tend to like good news better than bad news. The question is, should it go to print? Does your heart beat faster because of that imagined headline? If so, click the heart. If you think, it's okay, but it's not that interesting, then advance. We want you to be discerning. Don't like them all. Try to make some bubble up more than others. And if possible, give preference to the ones that pertain directly or indirectly to the issue of climate and to something that the Red Cross can do something about. I see a lot of you are contributing. Thank you very much. Keep it coming. You're an editor working fast. You have 30 seconds. Let's give you less than half a minute. And we are going to advance to the next one. I'm going to just go straight into the final report. I didn't have a chance to review them. So the most upvoted new tech solves hunger. My friends, as someone working in technology, I wish this to be true, but you know what? I have news. Technology already exists for solving hunger. The reason why we still have hunger is not the absence of technology, is the absence of caring. How can we help people care, nations care, that if someone is hungry and food is in existence or could be made to exist, how can we harness the power of the climate narrative to do more of that? Rising temperatures destroy crops, polar ice vaporize, farmers flee, families save due to fast thinking of other people. I love it. Can you be those other people? How can you think fast? How can we help the American Red Cross and its partners be the fast thinkers that save? Extraterrestrials not coming. Okay, there's a lot here. Plastics and apocalypse and peace prevails and so much more. I'm going to leave this on. What I want to mention as I wrap up my portion is that you have experienced a combination of knowledge imparted by our dear experienced Simfi, who has been working with very difficult contexts in very professional settings that are hard to make happen, with these other playful activities that invite you to engage, that invite you and others to connect, to learn, to figure out together. So my invitation to you is be exploratory, be courageous, be innovative as you think of how to have difficult conversations about climate. What we can do now in the 3 minutes that we have left is I will pass it over to Simfiwe to wrap up. And then if you want, write any questions you may have in the chat of the Zoom. We know with certainty that we can't answer many, but Simfiwe and I can stay a few minutes after the scheduled end, which is in a few minutes. I can stay at least 15 more minutes, and maybe we can answer some questions, address some concerns. Thank you for your time. Simfiwe, over to you.
Thanks so much, Pablo. Yep, to echo what Pablo said, and very briefly, I hope what you've taken away from this is both a sort of overview. I know there was a lot of information, but a very overview sort of introduction to some of the work of the ICRC, how it relates to international humanitarian law, those Geneva principles, the functions or the role of the ICRC in situations of armed conflict, and finally, how climate change makes some of that work difficult. And so why it is necessary to continuously think critically and creatively about how to approach work that's really been ongoing for decades, but obviously has to change in response to contemporary trends. I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who I understand is closing, while you think about additional questions that you have. As Pablo mentioned, we'll stay on for a couple more minutes. And I think one of our colleagues at American Red Cross will be sharing mine and Pablo's emails in case you want to keep in touch. And all of you should receive a copy of the presentation at the end of today's summit. Thanks so much for your attention.
Yes, so I just want to thank everyone for coming, especially our speakers. They did such an amazing job, and their interactive activities were definitely a great way, and I do hope everyone learned something. I will be passing it on to Larissa, who has some closing information, but I just want to say thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Sarah, for leading us in this exciting opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen here, so just give me 1 second, everyone. And as we said in the beginning, this was just the first event of many in our YAC Summit series to kick off this exciting theme we have this year in the Youth Action Campaign of the environment and how it's affecting armed conflict and how armed conflict affects the environment. So we're going to be exploring concepts like climate change and internally displaced person patterns, wildlife protections, environmental justice, all sorts of things. So if you are interested in learning more about what we're doing, like Simfiwe said on the next slide here, I'm going to have some of our information for getting in touch or getting involved in our programs. Just to echo Sarah, we're just so grateful to have a partnership with Simfiwe and Pablo over at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. I hope you all leave empowered and motivated to have these conversations around the dinner table with your peers, over water cooler talk, whatever it may be, because that's the first step, like Pablo said, right? So just to give you a little snapshot of what the rest of our summit is going to look like. Again, it's just a mix of events to get us launching into this new theme of environmental justice and armed conflict. And then some other opportunities for both youth and adults alike to kind of delve into their leadership and learn about maybe different career paths. And then of course, we're going to spotlight a lot of our youth and their programs and projects from last year. So I think Eric our colleague is putting these in the chat as we go, but just to give a little brief description about each. Tomorrow we have a great opportunity from one of our youth interns who represented the American Red Cross as a youth delegate at the statutory meetings in Geneva. She's going to share her experience, so hopefully you can all join that. We have a 2-day intensive leadership boot camp at the end of this week. This one, I should say this, all of these, including this one, are all recorded except for the boot camp. That's going to be a lot of kind of intensive work and diving into individuals' experience. So we just want to keep that information private and closed to those coming. The links here, again, are the same as the ones that Eric has in the chat, but for those of you that are viewing this recording, we just wanted to use tiny URL so you're able to register. Next week, we're going to come back to the environmental theme, and we have an expert to talk about international environmental law and how it protects the planet. We also have our friends from the Restoring Family Links program here at the American Red Cross doing a simulation with us, calling it a walk in their shoes. Another great opportunity, very similar to this one, breaking that fourth wall, really going to give you a simulation of what it's like to experience displacement and what our RFL program does. The following week, we're going to have a national symposium, which I see a lot of names here today. Some of our students here are going to be presenting at, and this is a great opportunity to learn about our Youth Action Campaign program and what our youth really do and lead in these global conversations and global discourse. We will, the next day after that, do a little career panel, and it's probably more a little focused on for young people, kind of just seeing what other people's journeys were in finding their career and their stride in either international relief work, law, and of course the Red Cross. And for those of you who have been around for a while, you know we love our pop culture series. So we will wrap up that week on Friday for Harry Potter's birthday. I know it's the end of the month, but just so everyone can come on that weekday, Harry Potter and the Deathly Violations of IHL Part 2, coming to you live on July 29th at noon Eastern Time. And finally, we'll wrap up with our national showcase. Again, it's an opportunity to learn more about our program and see our selected advocates who've been working really hard all month during this summit to present to everybody, both public and internal to the Red Cross, to hopefully get you all excited about what we're doing in this program and the value that it has, not only for teaching the rules of war, but also for young people to have, again, a platform for their voice for things that they care about. As Cynthia said, we just wanted to share our information. Again, the links are in the chat for the events, and I believe also Eric put Cynthia and Pablo's emails directly into the chat. But if you're interested more in any of our programs, you're welcome to connect with us on our websites here, climatecenter.org. And for the American Red Cross, we have our Rules of War blog and our learning more about our specific programs of adult IHL dissemination and the Youth Action Campaign there. And feel free to reach out to us directly at the American Red Cross. Our team is led by our fearless leader, Thomas Harper, our senior legal advisor. You can see his email there. And Christian leads our adult dissemination program. And again, I support the Youth Action Campaign as the program officer. So feel free to reach out if you're interested in learning more, you want to get involved, you want to become a volunteer, you want to get your students involved, anything, any way that we can help connect you to this important work, we are happy to do. Like Pablo said, we're around for a little bit, so I'm going to drop screen so everyone can continue the conversation. But at this point, we will stop the recording and hope to see you all tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.